the stillness of night, when shadows grow long and an icy chill settles in the air, they say the Onryo walks among us. A spirit forged from betrayal and anguish. Its purpose is singular, vengeance. Unlike ghosts that linger out of longing or confusion, the Onryo is driven by an unquenchable hatred, bound to this world by the weight of its torment. You'll recognize it by its long, tangled black hair veiling a pale, lifeless face, and the flowing white burial robes that seem to float above the ground. Some claim its hollow eyes can pierce into your very soul, exposing your guilt, fears, and sins. Its wrath knows no bounds. Those who wronged it are doomed to suffer, but even the unfortunate souls who cross its path may fall victim to its merciless curse. For centuries, whispers of its presence have lingered, passed down in fearful murmurs from one generation to the next. The Onryo cannot be bargained with, nor can its hunger for justice or destruction be easily satisfied. If you sense the chilling touch of its approach, take heed. What kind of injustice could give rise to such relentless fury? And, more ominously, who might it be seeking tonight? The Yoshinaga Ryokan was a place where time had long since grown moss. Its darkened wooden beams and paper-thin walls held whispers of centuries, and the smell of old cedar mingled with the faint trace of incense. Perched on the edge of a forest thick with towering pines and whispering winds, it was a sanctuary for travelers, and a prison for the secrets it refused to release. Hana, the Ryokan's caretaker, moved like a shadow through the dimly lit halls, her face composed but her eyes betraying the weight of her burden. Hana had began working at the Ryokan after leaving her family and starting a new life, but her new duty, Hana had come to learn, often came with chains. She knew the stories of the Onryo, vengeful spirits that clung to the Ryokan like a second skin. Her mother had warned her of their presence, their silent rage, their unrelenting sorrow. Hana's role was not just to manage the Ryokan, but to coexist with its restless inhabitants, ensuring their wrath never spilled beyond its walls. One cold evening, as the wind hissed through the trees and rattled the shutters, an old man arrived at the Ryokan. He introduced himself as Shigeru, a retired teacher seeking solace in the countryside. His face was lined with years of knowledge and regret, and his eyes held a weary curiosity as he stepped into the Ryokan's shadowed interior. "Welcome to Yoshinaga," Hana said, bowing deeply. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as though she were reluctant to draw attention to herself. "Your room is ready, room 12, at the end of the hall." Shigeru nodded, his footsteps muffled by the tatami mats as he followed her. The hallway stretched endlessly in the dim light, the flickering lanterns casting long, trembling shadows. The air grew colder as they approached his room, and Shigeru felt a subtle pressure in his chest, as though the Ryokan itself was testing his resolve. "If you need anything, please let me know," Hana said, sliding the door open. The room was sparse but clean, with a low table, a futon, and a single vase holding a withered branch. The window overlooked the forest, now cloaked in darkness. "Thank you," Shigeru replied, his voice echoing faintly. He placed his bag on the floor and settled into the room as Hana slid the door shut. He couldn't shake the feeling that her departure left the room emptier than it had been. That night, the Ryokan came alive with sound. It began as a low creak, the groan of ancient wood adjusting to the cold. Then came the distant patter of footsteps, so light they might have been imagined. Shigeru lay on the futon, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as a shriek pierced the silence. It was faint but unmistakable, a sound of raw anguish that sent a chill racing down his spine. He sat up, his breath fogging in the cold air. The room seemed darker than before, the corners impossibly deep. He told himself it was the wind, the age of the building, but the rationalizations felt hollow. Another sound broke the stillness, a whisper, close yet incomprehensible. Shigeru turned his head sharply toward the corner of the room. A figure stood there. It was a woman, her long black hair hanging limp and lifeless around her face. Her kimono was pale and tattered, the fabric stained with dark, wet streaks. Her face was partially obscured by her hair, but her eyes, those wide, gleaming eyes, burned with a malevolence that froze Shigeru in place. She didn't move, yet the air between them seemed to hum with tension. "Who?" Shigeru began, but his voice failed him. The woman tilted her head, the motion sharp and unnatural, like a marionette yanked by invisible strings. She took a step forward, her bare feet silent against the tatami. Suddenly, the room's temperature plummeted. Shigeru's breath came in rapid bursts, visible in the freezing air. The woman's lips parted, and a guttural choking sound escaped her throat. It wasn't a voice but a wail, an unholy lament that echoed through the room. Shigeru scrambled back, his heart pounding until his hand struck the wall behind him. The woman stopped, her eyes locked onto his. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The room was empty, but the oppressive weight of her presence lingered. Shigeru didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, watching the shadows of the forest shift and dance. When morning came, he confronted Hana in the Ryokan's main room. "This place is haunted," he said, his voice shaking. Hana's expression didn't change. "I know," she said simply. "Why didn't you warn me? Would you have stayed if I had?" Shigeru had no answer to that. He stared at Hana, searching her face for some sign of remorse or fear. But she remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You should leave," she said after a moment. "The longer you stay, the harder it will be." Shigeru wanted to leave, but a morbid curiosity held him back. That night he returned to room 12, his nerves raw and frayed. He lit a small lamp and kept it by his side, the faint glow a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. The sounds began again, creaks, whispers, faint cries that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Shigeru tried to ignore them, but his resolve crumbled when he glanced toward the corner. The woman was there again, but she was not alone. Beside her stood another figure, a man. He was taller, his posture rigid and his face frozen in an expression of wide-eyed horror. His mouth hung open, as though caught in a silent scream, and his gaze was fixed on the far wall, unblinking and unseeing. The woman moved first, her head jerking toward Shigeru with a snap that made his stomach lurch. Her husband remained still, his lifeless eyes drilling into the void. The air grew heavier with each passing second, and Shigeru felt as though he were drowning in their presence. The woman advanced, her movements unnaturally fluid yet disjointed. She reached out a hand, her fingers claw-like and trembling. Shigeru couldn't move, his body paralyzed by an invisible force. Her touch was icy and searing all at once, and as her fingers grazed his arm, visions flooded his mind. He saw the Ryokan as it once was, bustling with life and laughter. He saw the woman, alive and radiant, her husband by her side. He saw the betrayal, the blood, the despair that had turned their love into a curse. The images were fleeting but vivid, searing themselves into his memory. When Shigeru came to, he was alone. The lamp had gone out, and the room was silent save for the sound of his ragged breathing. He stumbled to the door and fled into the hallway, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the stillness. Hana was waiting for him in the main room, her expression unreadable. "You saw them," she said. It wasn't a question. "Why?" Shigeru demanded. "Why do they haunt this place? Why do you stay?" Hana's gaze dropped to the floor. "I'm bound to this Ryokan, just as they are. The Onryo. They were guests of the inn. Their love turned to hatred, their lives to death. I have been allowed life so long as I remain. And the guests? What happens to them? Most leave before it's too late." Shigeru's blood ran cold. "And if they don't?" Hana didn't answer. She didn't need to. Shigeru left the Ryokan at dawn, his heart heavy with dread. As he walked away, the wind carried the faint sound of a shriek, a reminder of the spirits that would never rest. As long as he stepped foot in room 12 of Yoshinaga a single time, he was bound to the Onryo forever.